Yeah. Please tell me that I can't, that I won't, that I fail, that I'll never make it out, yeah. Please tell me all the bad, never good, fill my head full of every single doubt, yeah. Please say any negative thoughts, I pop off when I hear people say I cannot. I get off to the thought of proving everyone wrong, I won't stop to the top, so you better back off and get lost. I'ma stay loud, stay proud, never running out, never heading south. I'll be spreading out, call it word of mouth, can't put me down, I'll be getting loud. You can have it douse, not what I'm about, have your cloud, it be raining now, I keep making sound.
I think you have to imagine how unforgiving this terrain was. I'm going to flip around to show you what they must have seen when they got here. I want you to see the terrain here, especially close to landing, would have been like. Imagine not knowing where you are and thinking, how do we sustain ourselves through this? So I would imagine they were heavily dependent on the indigenous people to be able to make it to this land. Even the smell is unforgiving. It's remind me of the smell when I was young, almost like sugar cane. Going to a sugar cane plantation where they make sugar. It reminds me of that smell. It's sort of a pungent smell. It's not a smell you often forget. But as you come into this park, to Jamestown settlement, this is what you're greeted with. And it's very interesting where you see these things at. And there's very few here in the States. And this is one right here. It's an obelisk. Where do you see these at too often? Well, where would you say these things are native to? How many?
104, so it's 104 feet tall.
104 feet tall. Because?
The number of the first colonists, their number was 104 of them.
Nice, nice. That's interesting. I'll come back. You can tell me the rest of it when I get back. Where's the tour, by the way? I was trying to catch up with the tour.
The first African tour. He's down there by the Angela site.
Oh, he went that way?
My name. She was from Angola.
Oh, okay.
He's the authority. He's down there. I can see the people.
I could see him right now, yeah.
I would head down that road and meet with him because he is the authority about the first Africans, the lady named Angela.
Her name was Angela.
Yeah.
Great. Is he coming this way once he's done, or is just?
Eventually, we'll walk down that middle road.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know when he's going to do it. He started too, but you can catch him. I just fire away at those questions.
Gotcha. Appreciate you.
He's almost like an author.
Thank you. Maybe he will be.
John, what I've been trying to focus on, because you got to keep in mind who my typical audience is.
Mm-hmm.
They're generally going to be older white folks who are kind of like teetering the names of most of the Africans. We only know that there are 9 Africans at Jamestown and 8 they don't have their names recorded. And honestly, they lived and worked where you parked your car today.
Gotcha.
So you can't even begin there. So Angela was sort of like going to be the vehicle for us to talk about the others as best we can, as flawed as that is. But because they broke that case, it was Linda Haywood and John Thornton who broke the case that the Africans came from Angola because they traced back the Spanish ship. And we know that what's really going on is, particularly with the Dongo people right here, this is sometimes an oversight. I don't want to oversimplify this, but I think there definitely are African kingdoms who see the benefits of European trade, and there were African kingdoms who were suspicious, to oversimplify. Dongo is definitely in the latter category. They resisted Christianity, they resisted the Portuguese for many years, yeah, right there. And what's happening is the Dongo people are much more independent. Congo generally, to oversimplify, at first had a good relationship with the Portuguese. But sometimes what happens, you were talking about like, do we get racist visitors sometimes? You'll hear this, you'll see, well, didn't Africans sell themselves into slavery? And I think what's happening is no one sells themselves into slavery. Are there African kingdoms that war against other African kingdoms? Yeah. Are there Africans that mistreat other Africans? That's always been the case.
Absolutely.
Right? So if Dongo was like going to sell people, I'm just going to pick on the Dama people. If they conquer the Dama people and we're going to sell them, well, they're not brothers and
Well,
sisters.
you don't fight strangers. You find the people next door.
Yeah. And if these guys from Europe are going to come offer us guns and gold for it, sure, why not, right? We're not the same as them.
Right.
It's a
transaction.
It's transactional. And so you have African traders, you have European traders, and you have Arab traders. But the European transatlantic trade is offering so much money and so much of an enticement. Now more and more people want to get into the slave catching business, right? You've now created the rum market, you've created the gun market, and it's going to just devastate these coast communities. Of course, early on, the Europeans and stuff don't tend to go very far in the interior. But what's interesting is that's why they're going to hang out here. Portugal creates Luanda to be a base of operations. Usually the Europeans just stay right in here by the ships or by the harbor. Now, Luanda 400 years ago looked like Jamestown. Now it looks like Miami. I mean, it's the richest city down here. Oil and gas, I've heard. But the thing it is I think Angela is probably from Cabasa, which would be right about here between the Lucala and Latete River, which is here. It's not on the map. Right about here. Unfortunately, I don't think archaeology's been done there, and there's a major dam project that's going in there because there was this the businesswoman in Angola, who's the richest woman in Angola. She's got Russian money, and there's some sort of operation there that kind of is getting thwarted about building a big dam there. But anyway, this is most likely where Cabasa was, which is a city the size of London.
Eventually, it'll be underwater.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate because
something that happened in Egypt.
The same thing happened in Egypt. Yeah. And when people like, well, I've never heard of Dongo before. I'm like, you've heard of Wakanda?
Right.
Like, well, yeah. And I'm like, well, who wrote Black Panther? They're like, Ta-Nehisi Coates. And you know who his professor was at Howard? The same Linda Haywood who broke this story.
Exactly.
So when I watch the movie, I'm not watching a comic book. I'm watching this is what Linda Haywood wrote about. I love looking at that. But I think that's important because it shows you, because what I have to argue against sometimes is people will do okay, well, tell me what you really think. Well, no, I am telling you what I really think.
Right.
What does your boss make you do? I'm doing what I wrote.
Right.
And part of the thing that I'm trying to undo, particularly with a lot of my white crowd, especially if it's just them around, like, hey, tell me the real story. And I'll be like, look, you're trying to make excuses for this being indentured servitude when it isn't. I'm trying to make the case here as the prosecutor that I understand that slavery is not legal in England. I know this. I know it's not legal in Virginia. I know this. I also know piracy is not legal in Virginia and England. But we all know it's going on. It's de facto, not de jure. I completely will agree with anyone who says there's no de jure legalized slavery in Virginia until 1662. I know that. Right. But I'm saying there's a 40-year period where people are being trafficked off Africa and in just the English sense. And you're talking about a woman who's actually from a city that's destroyed, who was then chained to 5 other people in a couple, right? Couple, and marched to Luanda, put on the beach, baptized into a religion that's not her own, where she doesn't understand what baptism is going to be. The Portuguese priests are even telling you they're giving them Christian names. Angela, Antonio, Isabella, Juan, right? These aren't Angolan names. And now they would be, but not then. And then you've got Portuguese ships and Spanish ships operating here, because the Spanish are now allowed to operate here they share the monarchy with Spain now. Spain and Portugal share the same king, so now the Spanish are allowed to use their ships here. Point is, 1,000 Dongo people were captured. The Portuguese ships are going to go from Recife to Salvador, Brazil. Spanish had 2 routes. They went to Cartagena, Colombia, or they went to Veracruz, Mexico. So this is very much a Spanish ship on a Spanish route. This is something where people think I'm being controversial, but I don't think I am.
Well, I have a different theory. Go back to that.
Yeah,
Go back to that.
Yeah.
According to the, I guess you could say to his story, where Prince Philip wanted to start selling to get to the East Indies. There's most necessary went from upper Africa down the coast here.
Right.
Now, my theory is that they found out a lot of these folks knew how to make all sorts of things, grow rice and everything like that. They were great farmers, great warriors, and they could last, all the things that had to happen to build this particular area.
I've heard this too about Angolans with rice production, because a lot of Angolans end up being taken to South Carolina and Georgia for the rice production.
To rice, I went to the rice the rice tour down in the Carolinas. So this whole region, I think, was very important to the Portuguese, having to raid
Yes.
these people and bring them over to do their bidding. So I think that's the one story we don't really tell.
Oh, I forgot another one I hadn't told you too. Mozambique's here. There was also the idea of to unite the two coasts, along with what you said.
Right.
I guess you're going down the
interesting
Kwanzaa River,
story.
yeah.
I just think, like you said, sometimes we oversimplify the story where it's
Yeah.
so much more complicated.
It is, and where I'm weakest is in my knowledge of too much of the interior of what's happening in Rwanda. But I have been doing a lot more original research on race in England, is what I've focused on. But what I am trying to tell some people is I think that from the English point of view, this is not an accident. I think the other
Most definitely not.
Well, you know, I mean, like some people think like, well, we're just looking for Spanish gold ships, and we just attack the ship and Africans are on board. The reason that doesn't really make sense is Spanish treasure ships have convoys. They're hard targets.
Right.
Slave ships are soft targets. They don't have any protection because they didn't even have enough guns. They didn't want anyone to take the gun. I mean, they're not as well protected. And the thing is, everybody knows those slave trade routes. And the thing is, the San Juan Batista wasn't going eastbound. Gold ships go eastbound.
Right,
It was going westbound from that direction of Africa.
Right.
I think they knew they could make a quick score by taking the Africans and selling them in Bermuda and Virginia.
True.
And so it's matching up the Caribbean piracy record, at least whatever we're getting out of this story here. And the other thing...
Has anyone ever followed the money for the Virginia Tobacco Company? What they became after that, and after that?
Oh,
and
here's the
after
thing.
that?
It gets
I think that's where the story really gets really
they get
interesting.
put out of business. Well, here's the I have. They get put out of business in 1625. See, what happens is in 1622. So the Powhatan and African story, they're interwoven, and sometimes we do separate tours. We forget this. In 1622, when Upachanganu launches the surprise attack on the English on a 90-mile front of land, kills what, a third of the English colony within 30 minutes. Coordinated attack, planned for years. Boom, right? That's like the biggest shockwave the English ever get. They don't see it coming. They take that gut punch for about a year or so. And then what happens is the English, what's happening is the king is like personally offended. Like he never cared about Jamestown before, but now he's like, he's sending them the best weapons now. Instead of this hodgepodge stuff we have, they're getting better weapons. They're getting better soldiers. They're getting not professional soldiers, but they're getting more people.
Well, now he's invested. He don't want to lose that pot of money.
That's right.
Absolutely.
And then they start investigating the Virginia Company for the incompetence of this. Once it's like any kind of correctional hearing. Once they start going down that path, they start looking at other things. They start uncovering how much the Virginia Company was engaging in piracy and robbing for Spanish goods and trafficking goods here through the court system. And basically, by 1625, King James decides to put the Virginia Company out of business.
Wow.
But at no point are they talking about the immorality of enslaving Africans. Because, of course, even in the days of Elizabeth I, Drake and Hawkins were taking Africans from Panama, from Havana, from Santo Domingo, right? And we know they were doing that during the wars with the Spanish. The point is, very rarely do we ever hear what happens to the Africans when they're taken from the Spanish.
Absolutely. I think the French author Alexis de Tocqueville talks about the whole Panama, who they first saw when they hit Panama and all those different areas. I think the story is so interesting, and I think people don't realize, you said 1625, and you think forward 1775. That's a long gap.
Yeah.
That's a long gap of things that happen here. The people that got trafficked here, or people that got trafficked throughout these areas here.
150 years.
Yeah, it's a long time.
Least. And frankly, one of the most profitable businesses in the history of the world.
Absolutely.
I mean,
it's not talked about.
Yeah. And then the fact is, I wanted to share with you what I'm doing personally. Because I've been working all this stuff we talked about for a while. What I wanted to kind of get into.
Go ahead.
No, if they're going back to London, right? And they just drop their ships off here, off you go. You're poor, you know the language. Where are you going to move to? The Lower East Side. This is the beginning of the East End of London. This is Whitechapel, where Jack the Ripper was. Like, this is the beginning of the most working class part of England of all time. Now, the reason I think that matters is that, to me, backstory is important. When you get the 1596 order from Queen Elizabeth, she says, too many Negroes and blackamoors have been carried in my realm from the troubles with Spain. It's talking about Drake and Hawkins.
Now, you said something interesting. He said something really interesting that people are probably going to miss on. He said, how do you ascertain the difference between Negroes and blackamoors.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know. I know that Blackmore tends to be used more in earlier Middle Ages. I think when they use Negro with a capital N, they're referring to people who are already enslaved or probably in the Caribbean. And Blackamoor may represent people literally from Africa or people who are European of African descent. And I might get that wrong, but I generally think that Negroes since almost always being used in a slavery context and Blackamoor in a color context.
Gotcha.
Also, we're in this period transitioning from medieval to modern. So sometimes old terms and new terms are being interchangeable. You don't see Blackmore much after the 1600s,
Gotcha.
but you did much earlier. But what to me that tells me is there's an admonition, right, that it's the Africans being carried over because of the wars. I think Drake and Hodge is just dumping them off in this neighborhood. People are living in these rough neighborhoods. Now here's the thing. I started doing the finding out who these people were by name. These are just the Christian people, because these are the people being for the rise in crime, for immorality, for not being true Christians, even though they're in church parishes. Whatever you want to throw. And she hires a Dutch ship captain named Casper van Sinden to round up the black community of London to deport them, right? There are other historians who've brought this up before. I'm not the first one to figure this out.
Right.
But what frustrates me is every time I see somebody else write about this, they just assume that the order was followed. Because the Queen gave the order. Of course they followed the orders.
Right.
Oh, I found something else out. The Dutch ship captain came back to the Queen and said, I don't have anybody. Nobody helped me.
Oh, wow.
Now, think of it. I'm conjecturing now, but I want to find this out. I think the royal government went into these neighborhoods. And let's just say these people don't like each other. Do you know who they don't like more? Somebody from the office of the Queen saying, round up your neighbors. Get lost.
That is very interesting.
Because I found another record from a little bit later, like 50 years later. This British author is like, look at St. Botolph's Aldgate. What a nice neighborhood. It's got the lowest reported crime in London. I'm like, it's because no one goes in there. Like, they're missing the point of the document. These are places where the gentry don't go. And they're the integrated places. So what does this matter for Virginia, I think? Where are the white indentured servants coming from? What neighborhoods, right? In London. And now you have these enslaved Africans. Because you see, right here where we're sitting, I think this
So you think this was more of an exodus than anything else?
I think what's happening is you've got these white servants. Obviously, and I'm saying some of them got trafficked too, not the same way Africans get trafficked. But I do know, for example, that debtors were forced to come to Virginia. I know that people for petty crimes were being transported to Virginia, like Australia style. And I know that there's a story where there were people trying to kidnap women illegally and send them to Virginia. So yeah, there are some cases. But what I'm saying is, if you look at the English class system, there's a lot of people the English are trying to get rid of by sending them over here to be servants, right? Now you got Angela here. I think she's first walking the streets of Jamestown right here, because this is where Pierce should have had his dock.
Gotcha.
We're on Pierce land right here. You got to ignore all the bricks. I just pretend these are all wood buildings here. The Pierce family had their own warehouse here. And here's one for you. What kind of job is Angela doing? Well, right there, this might be a good one for you, but what you see and what you don't see. We know the Pierce family owns all this land, right? I walked past this sign for 5 years.
Hold on a second.
I walked past this sign for 5 years and didn't really read it. I mean, I knew the quote, but it didn't dawn on me. Okay, so here's a surviving fig bush. So it's a fig bush. But this is where the Pierce family used to have fig bushes 400 years ago.